Have you ever wondered if a single decision could change the course of your entire life? What if one simple act of kindness could lead you down a path you never expected? Imagine this. A young boy, just trying to get by, finds himself in the right place at the right time? Or is it fate? On a quiet, deserted road, a luxury car is flipped over, its driver lying unconscious and bleeding, struggling for his life. What would you do in that moment? This is exactly what happened to Darnell, a teenager from a rough neighborhood, when he stumbled upon a scene that would turn his world upside down. He didn't know who the man was, or why he ended up in that ditch, but he knew one thing. He couldn't just drive away. What happens next? Could a random act of kindness really lead to something bigger than you ever imagined? Hold on tight, because this story is about to take you on a journey of unexpected twists, deep connections, and a future full of hope. Don't blink. You won't believe how this story unfolds. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. Is the weather chilly where you are? If so, be sure to bundle up and stay warm. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss another inspiring story like this. Let's get started. The road stretched endlessly before Darnell, a long, deserted highway that seemed to go on forever, with only the hum of his car to break the silence. The fading light of dusk cast long shadows on the cracked pavement, and he could feel the weight of the quiet pressing in from every side. It was just another evening, another routine drive home. But what Darnell didn't know was that this drive would change everything, forever. He had been heading back to his small apartment after another long day of work. His mind was preoccupied with his responsibilities, his mom's medical bills, the rent due in a few days, and the weight of knowing that at just 16, he was carrying a burden far too heavy for someone his age. The air inside the car was cool, the music barely audible, and the road ahead seemed as empty as his thoughts. But then, something caught his eye, a gleam of metal in the distance. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the sleek, black silhouette of a car, half submerged in a ditch off to the side of the road. The kind of car that screamed money, luxurious, polished, and clearly out of place in the middle of nowhere. Darnell's pulse quickened. It looked as though it had crashed, its front end buried deep in the earth, the windshield shattered, and the tires still spinning in a futile attempt to move. Darnell's instincts kicked in. He didn't even think twice. With one swift motion, he swerved his old sedan to the side of the road and slammed on the brakes. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he pulled over, heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, the world around him seemed to pause. The car had been wrecked, but the real question was anyone still alive? He opened the door and stepped out, his sneakers crunching against the rough gravel as he made his way toward the wreckage. The wind had picked up, carrying a chill with it, but it was nothing compared to the sense of urgency rising in Darnell's chest. The car's driver's side door was dented, half submerged in the ditch. Darnell's eyes scanned the scene, trying to make sense of what had happened. That's when he saw him. A man, lying on the ground, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood was seeping from a gash on his forehead, staining his pristine white shirt. He was dressed in an expensive suit, the kind of clothes someone would wear to a high-powered business meeting. His shoes, polished black leather, were now covered in dirt. The man's face was pale, his eyes fluttering open and closed as if he was struggling to stay conscious. His lips moved, but his voice was barely a whisper. "Help, hospital, please." The words came out in gasps, barely audible over the wind that whipped around them. Darnell's stomach tightened. He could see the desperation in the man's eyes, the fear of knowing that he might not survive this accident. The man's body was trembling, his hand raised weakly as if reaching for something, anything to hold on to. The sight of him, so vulnerable and broken, shook Darnell to his core. For a brief moment, Darnell stood frozen, staring at the man, unsure of what to do. He had never been in a situation like this before. But then his mother's voice echoed in his mind, the same words she had always told him. If you can help, you help, no matter what. That was all the motivation Darnell needed. He rushed to the man's side, crouching beside him. The man's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one more labored than the last. His eyes were barely focused, but when they met Darnell's, there was a flicker of recognition, a silent plea for help. "Hey, stay with me," Darnell said, his voice steady even though his heart was racing. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder, trying to comfort him, though he felt anything but calm inside. "I'm gonna get you out of here, okay? Just stay with me." The man's eyes closed for a moment, and Darnell's heart sank. He couldn't lose him. Not like this. Hey. Darnell shook the man gently, trying to rouse him. "Look at me. You're gonna be okay. I'm gonna help you." The man's eyes flickered open again, though it was clear he was slipping. Darnell glanced at the car, realizing it wasn't going anywhere. The engine was still running, but the damage was too severe. The car wasn't going to move on its own, and there was no time to wait for someone else to show up. Darnell had to act fast. "Okay, I'm taking you to the hospital," Darnell said, more to himself than to the man. His voice was steady, but the gravity of the situation hit him hard. He had no idea who this man was, but he couldn't just leave him here. Not when he had the power to do something. He took a deep breath and carefully lifted the man, doing his best to support his fragile body. The man winced in pain but didn't protest. Darnell's arms were strong, but the weight of the situation was something he hadn't anticipated. "Hold on," Darnell muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the stranger he was carrying. The man's blood stained his hands, but Darnell didn't stop. There was no time to hesitate. With all his strength, Darnell half-dragged, half-carried the man toward his car. The scene was chaotic in his mind. He could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, but they felt so far away. He could feel the weight of the man's life in his hands, and it was all he could do to keep moving. The man's breath was shallow, his pulse weak. Darnell could see the fading color in his face, the way the man was growing colder by the second. It was a race against time. Once inside the car, Darnell carefully laid the man down in the back seat, trying to keep him as comfortable as possible despite the limited space. He jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, his mind racing. Every second mattered. He sped down the road, the hospital not far, but it felt like miles away. The man's breathing grew quieter, slower, and Darnell's pulse quickened with every passing moment. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his heart pounding as the hospital's emergency lights came into view. As he pulled up to the emergency entrance, a team of doctors and nurses rushed out. They took the man from Darnell's car, quickly wheeling him into the building. Darnell stayed for a moment, his heart still racing in his chest. He had done what he could. The rest was in the hands of the professionals now, but as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just become part of something much bigger than himself. He had saved a life, but little did he know, the man he had rescued wasn't just anyone. His act of kindness would change Darnell's life in ways he could never have imagined. Darnell's apartment was quiet when he walked through the door, the kind of silence that filled every corner and weighed down on your chest. He closed the door softly behind him, trying not to make a sound, as if the stillness might somehow break if he disturbed it too much. It had been another long day at the auto repair shop, and as usual, Darnell's mind was clouded with thoughts of bills, medical expenses, and the looming uncertainty of how to keep his family afloat. His mother, Angela, was sitting at the small kitchen table, her hands resting limply in her lap. Her once vibrant face had lost some of its color, and the deep lines around her eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent worrying about how to make ends meet. Angela had always been strong, resilient even, but lately, the strain of her chronic illness and the pressure of their financial difficulties had worn her down. She hadn't been able to work for months now, and every visit to the doctor seemed to bring more bad news. "Hey, Mom," Darnell said, trying to sound casual as he kicked off his sneakers by the door and walked over to her. Angela looked up, her expression softening for a moment before the familiar worry crept back into her eyes. "Darnell, how was your day?" she asked, her voice hoarse but kind. She forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It was all right," Darnell replied, sitting down at the table across from her. He didn't mention the crash he had seen earlier. He didn't want to add to her concerns, especially when it seemed like every day brought new challenges. Instead, he gave her a reassuring nod. "Nothing much, just the usual." Angela nodded back, but her gaze was distant, focused on something only she could see. Her mind was occupied with a million things. Things Darnell had tried and failed to shield her from. Things like the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, the rent that was overdue, and the constant calls from the hospital about the mounting medical debt. It wasn't easy. And with Darnell being the only one able to work, the weight of it all was crushing. "I'm sorry I couldn't get to the store today," Angela said quietly, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the worn tablecloth. "I just don't have the strength to go out anymore. The doctor said I need to take it easy, but the pain, it's just too much." Darnell's heart sank as he looked at her, his mind racing to figure out a way to fix everything. He hated seeing her like this, helpless, trapped in her own body, unable to work, unable to support him the way she used to. It wasn't fair. She had always been the one who worked tirelessly to make sure he had everything he needed, even when it meant sacrificing her own dreams. And now, the roles had reversed. It was his turn to take care of her. "It's okay, Mom. Don't worry about it," Darnell said, forcing a smile. He reached across the table and took her hand, trying to reassure her even though he felt just as lost. "I'll take care of everything." Angela's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head, a sigh escaping her lips. "You're still just a boy, Darnell. You shouldn't have to carry all this weight. You're my son. I should be the one taking care of you." Darnell squeezed her hand tighter, his jaw clenched in determination. "Mom, you've done enough for me. You've given me everything you had. It's my turn now. You don't need to worry about anything." The words felt hollow as soon as they left his mouth. He was just a kid, after all. How could he possibly shoulder the burden of a whole family? And yet, he knew that if he didn't step up, who would? He had to find a way to keep them going. He had to. Angela wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and though her face was still full of worry, she nodded. "I know you're doing your best, baby. I'm just so tired of everything. I can't even keep food in the house half the time. And the bills. Every day there's another one. It's like we're sinking, and I can't help you." Darnell took a deep breath, his mind racing. He hated hearing his mom talk like this. He knew she was right. They were sinking, slowly but surely. But Darnell wasn't about to let them drown. Not while he still had the strength to fight. "I'll figure something out, Mom. I swear," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet desperation. "I'll find another job, maybe work more hours at the shop. We'll make it work. You just focus on getting better. I've got this." Angela didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat in silence for a moment, her tired eyes searching Darnell's face. Then, with a sigh, she nodded, though the worry never fully left her gaze. "I just wish you didn't have to do all this, Darnell. You're too young to carry the weight of the world." "I'm not too young," Darnell said, his voice firm. "I'm old enough to take care of you. We'll get through this. I promise." His words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. But despite the doubt gnawing at his insides, Darnell felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know how, but somehow, he would make things right. He had to. In the other room, his younger sister, Maya, was playing with her toys, her innocent giggles filling the space with a lightness that Darnell couldn't quite reach. His little brother, Eli, was running around the apartment, full of energy, not yet old enough to understand the gravity of their situation. It was both a comfort and a cruel reminder of how little their family had left. These two kids deserved more than what life had dealt them. Darnell was determined to give them a better future. He just didn't know how. As the evening wore on, Darnell tried to push the weight of his mother's worry from his mind. He distracted himself by helping Maya with her homework, fixing dinner for the family, and doing the best he could to make their cramped apartment feel like home. But every time he looked at his mom, he felt the crushing pressure of their reality. How much longer could they keep going like this? Later that night, as Darnell lay in bed, the weight of the day settling over him, his mind kept returning to one thought. He couldn't fail. He couldn't fail his family. They had already lost so much, and Darnell was determined to make sure they didn't lose each other. Tomorrow, he would figure it out. Tomorrow, he would find a way to fix everything. But for tonight, all he could do was hold his mother's words close to his heart. The promise he had made, to take care of them, no matter the cost, was more than just words. It was his lifeline, and Darnell would fight to keep that promise, even if it meant going to places he had never imagined. The road ahead would be hard, but he was ready. He had to be. It was a little after noon when the knock on the door came. Darnell had been sitting at the kitchen table, trying to focus on his homework, though his mind kept drifting. He couldn't shake the thought of the man he had rescued the day before. The way the man's blood had stained Darnell's hands, the sound of his faint breaths as Darnell drove him to the hospital. Darnell didn't even know the man's name. All he knew was that his actions had possibly saved a life. But now, the knock at the door, sharp and urgent, brought Darnell back to reality. He looked up, his heart skipping a beat as his mother, Angela, rose from her chair and made her way to the door. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, revealing two police officers standing on the other side, their uniforms crisp and their faces serious. "Good afternoon, ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice calm but firm. "We're looking for a young man named Darnell. Is he home?" Angela froze. Darnell's stomach twisted. He stood up, feeling the weight of their eyes on him as they shifted toward him. His mother looked back at him, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "I'm Darnell," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The officers studied him for a moment, as if weighing something in their minds. "Are you the young man who stopped to help the man in the crash yesterday?" one of the officers asked. Darnell's chest tightened at the mention of the crash, his thoughts racing. He glanced at his mother, who seemed to be holding her breath. "Yes, that's me," Darnell replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The officers exchanged a look before the first one spoke again. "We need to speak with you about the incident. It's important." Darnell felt his pulse quicken, his mind spinning. He had helped someone. What could possibly be so important about that? As the officers led him outside, Darnell felt a strange, knot of fear settle in his stomach. Why were the police involved in something so simple as helping a stranger? He couldn't help but wonder if something more was at play here. As they drove to the police station, the air inside the car seemed to thicken with each passing minute. Darnell kept his eyes fixed on the road, not knowing what to expect or how to process what was happening. The officers didn't speak much, but Darnell's mind was racing. Had the man he saved been some kind of criminal? Or was there something he had missed during the whole ordeal? When they arrived at the station, the officers led Darnell into a small room, where another man sat behind a desk. The man was older, with silver hair and a sharp suit, his face etched with the lines of someone who had seen more than his share of life's darker sides. He glanced up as Darnell entered the room and gave him a measured nod. "Darnell, I presume?" The man's voice was smooth, but carried an authority that made Darnell uneasy. "Yes, sir," Darnell replied, trying to mask his unease. He had no idea what was going on, but he knew that whatever it wasn't good. "I'm Detective Lawrence, and I've been assigned to look into the accident involving a man named William Harrington," the detective said, his eyes narrowing as he studied Darnell. "Do you know him?" Darnell's heart skipped a beat at the name. He hadn't known who the man was, but the name sounded vaguely familiar. William Harrington? It sounded like someone important. "No, sir," Darnell replied truthfully. "I don't know him. I just helped him after the crash." Detective Lawrence leaned back in his chair, clearly studying Darnell. "Well, it turns out that Mr. Harrington is not just anyone. He's a billionaire businessman with more influence than you can imagine. The car you helped him from? It was no accident. Someone tried to run him off the road." Darnell's mouth went dry as the weight of the words sank in. A target? For a moment, the room seemed to spin, and he had to steady himself against the edge of the desk. "But why me?" Darnell asked, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. "Why did he need my help?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," the detective replied. "He's been refusing to speak about the incident, but we're sure he'll want to meet you now. He owes you his life, Darnell, and he's made it clear he wants to talk to you." Darnell felt his head spin. He had saved someone important, someone powerful, and now the police were involved. But why didn't the man, William Harrington, tell them what had really happened? Why had he left Darnell to take care of everything? As if sensing Darnell's confusion, Detective Lawrence continued, "Mr. Harrington is not just a businessman. He's the kind of man who has made enemies over the years. Powerful enemies. And the fact that you saved him, well, it doesn't go unnoticed. He wants to make sure that you're taken care of, Darnell. You and your family. Darnell's mind was reeling. The man he had helped, the man whose life he had saved, was a billionaire. A man with more power and wealth than Darnell had ever seen in his life. And now he was being told that this man wanted to thank him, wanted to help him. But what did that mean for Darnell? What kind of life was he about to be drawn into? Back at home, Darnell tried to process everything that had happened. The moment he walked through the door, his mother could see the worry written all over his face. Darnell, what's going on? Angela asked, her voice filled with concern. I don't know, Mom, Darnell said, running a hand through his hair, his mind a swirl of confusion. The police, they said Mr. Harrington is a billionaire. They want to meet with me, but I don't understand why. I didn't do it for any reward. I just wanted to help. Angela placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes soft with understanding. I know, Darnell. I know you didn't do it for any reward. But sometimes, when you do the right thing, it changes everything. Darnell looked at his mother, his heart heavy. But what does this mean for us, Mom? What does it mean for me? For you? Angela smiled faintly, though there was a trace of worry in her eyes. I don't know, baby. But whatever happens, we'll face it together. I'm proud of you, no matter what. And in that moment, Darnell realized that his life had already begun to change in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. The weight of his actions had set off a chain of events that could either lift his family out of their struggles or pull them deeper into a world of power and danger. But one thing was clear. He had a responsibility now. To his family, to himself, and to the man whose life he had saved. A few days after the accident, Darnell found himself in an unfamiliar setting. A taste of something that felt almost too good to be true. The hospital room where he'd rushed the man, whom he now knew as William, had become a turning point. It was not just the relief of knowing the man had survived, but also the overwhelming weight of the gratitude and kindness that had begun to pour into his life from people he never imagined he'd meet. Darnell and his mother, Angela, had agreed to meet William and his wife, Sophia, at a small cafe near their apartment. It was a neutral spot, neither too formal nor too casual. The meeting had been arranged after several calls from William, who had insisted on expressing his thanks in person. He had promised that he would do more than just say thank you. When they arrived at the cafe, Darnell was nervous. He'd never been the center of attention, especially not in a setting like this. The cafe was warm, with soft lighting that reflected the gentle mood of the late afternoon. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint scent of pastries in the air, but Darnell hardly noticed it. He was more focused on the looming question. What did William and Sophia want from him? Angela, always the more composed of the two, took Darnell's arm as they made their way to a corner table where William and Sophia were already sitting. William rose immediately when they approached, his tall frame towering over the table. He extended a hand, and Darnell shook it, still unsure of what was happening. Thank you, Darnell, William said, his voice deep and sincere. You saved my life. There's no way we can ever repay you for that, but we want to do whatever we can. Sophia, who had been sitting quietly beside William, smiled warmly at Darnell and Angela. We've heard a lot about you, Darnell, she added. You've been through so much, and we want to make sure you know that you're not alone. Darnell shifted awkwardly in his seat, feeling the weight of their words but unsure how to respond. His family had never been on the receiving end of such attention or generosity, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. In his world, nothing came for free, and nothing was handed to you. He had worked hard for everything he had, and even then, the struggle was constant. But here he was, sitting across from two people who seemed to be offering something he didn't know how to accept. You don't have to thank me, Darnell said quietly, looking down at the table. I just did what anyone else would do in that situation. William leaned forward, his eyes locking with Darnell's. No, he said firmly. Not everyone would have stopped. Not everyone would have put themselves in danger for a stranger, especially not someone like me. You don't understand how rare that is. Most people would have driven past, not even thinking twice. You changed my life, Darnell. Darnell shifted uncomfortably. He didn't think of it as something extraordinary. But as he looked at the sincerity in William's eyes, he began to understand why the man felt so indebted. Still, he wasn't used to people wanting to help him. Help had always been something Darnell had to find on his own, with no one asking for anything in return. He'd never had anyone extend their hand like this before. Angela, sensing the tension, placed a hand on her son's arm and looked at William and Sophia with gratitude. "We're just thankful you're okay," she said softly. Darnell did what he thought was right. "That's just the way he is." Sophia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We understand, but that doesn't mean we can't help. We'd like to get to know you better, Darnell, and your family. We've been through some tough times ourselves, and we know what it's like to struggle. If there's anything we can do, anything at all, we want to help." Darnell wasn't sure what to say. He could feel the sincerity in their words, but a part of him couldn't help but wonder if this was all too good to be true. Could they really help him? Could they really make a difference in his family's life? He had spent so long learning to rely only on himself that the idea of accepting help felt almost foreign. William, sensing Darnell's hesitation, added, "Darnell, you don't have to accept anything you're not comfortable with. We just want you to know that we're here for you. No strings attached. But if you ever need anything, whether it's advice, support, or even just someone to talk to, we're here." Darnell's throat tightened. He looked at his mother, who had a soft, knowing look in her eyes. Angela had always been the strong one, the one who kept their family together even when things seemed impossible. But even she, at this moment, looked slightly overwhelmed by the generosity of these strangers. It was as if they were offering something neither of them had ever had before: real, unconditional support. Darnell took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I don't know what to say," he murmured. "I've never had anyone offer to help like this before. My mom's been sick for a long time, and I've been trying to keep things together. But it's hard, really hard." Angela reached over and squeezed his hand, offering a small but reassuring smile. "We'll manage," she said softly. "We've always managed, haven't we, Darnell?" Darnell nodded, but the truth was, things were getting harder by the day. His mother's health was deteriorating, and the bills were piling up faster than he could keep track of. He had been juggling multiple jobs just to keep food on the table, but it was never enough. Despite his best efforts, it felt like they were slipping through the cracks, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. William and Sophia sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of Darnell's words settle. Then William spoke again, his voice low but filled with conviction. "You don't have to do this alone, Darnell. I know you're used to handling things on your own, but you don't have to carry all this by yourself. Let us help. We have the resources, and we want to use them to make a difference for you and your family." Darnell felt the tears well up in his eyes but fought them back, not wanting to show weakness in front of these strangers, even though he felt like he was crumbling inside. "I don't know if I can accept that," he said quietly. Sophia smiled softly, her eyes full of understanding. "It's not about accepting charity," she said. "It's about letting others be there for you when you need it. We all need help sometimes, Darnell, even the strongest of us." Darnell met her gaze and finally allowed himself to breathe a little easier. He didn't have all the answers, but maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something that could change everything for his family. Maybe he didn't have to do this all alone. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for everything." The four of them sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the conversation hanging between them, but the air felt lighter somehow. For the first time in a long time, Darnell felt a glimmer of hope. The weeks that followed the meeting with William and Sophia were a blur of quiet hope and unexpected change. Darnell felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, though it was replaced by a new kind of pressure, one that was born from the realization that his life could be different, that it could be better. No longer just a teenager working to help his struggling family, Darnell was beginning to see glimpses of a future that could be his, one where he was more than just another kid from a rough neighborhood. At school, Darnell's focus had sharpened. Something about the kindness from William and Sophia, the generosity of people who didn't have to care about him but chose to, pushed him to do better, to make his life count for something. For the first time in a long time, Darnell woke up each morning with a sense of purpose, a burning drive to succeed. His grades, which had always been average at best, began to improve dramatically. Teachers started noticing his newfound diligence. Ms. Andrews, his English teacher, raised an eyebrow one afternoon as she reviewed his latest essay. It wasn't just well-written. It had depth, insight, a kind of maturity that was rare for a high school sophomore. She pulled him aside after class. "Darnell," she said softly, with a mix of surprise and pride, "this is excellent work. I think you're capable of so much more than you realize. Keep it up." That praise stuck with him, like a spark igniting a flame. Darnell pushed himself harder, studying late into the night, making sure every paper was perfect, every equation solved. In math class, he tackled complex problems that had once seemed insurmountable, solving them with ease. The teachers began to notice his transformation, not just in his grades, but in the way he carried himself. There was a new confidence in him, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. By the end of the semester, Darnell was no longer just another face in the crowd. He had become one of the standout students in his grade. The other kids noticed, too. Darnell was the one they asked for help on homework now, the one who stayed after school to work with teachers when things got tough. He was no longer invisible. One afternoon, just as he was about to leave for home, Darnell was called into Mr. Garcia's office. Mr. Garcia was the school's guidance counselor, a quiet, thoughtful man with graying hair and glasses that always seemed to sit slightly crooked on his nose. Darnell had always liked him, though they hadn't really spoken much. He wasn't sure why Mr. Garcia wanted to see him, but it made him nervous nonetheless. "Come in, Darnell," Mr. Garcia said, motioning for him to sit down. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." Darnell slid into the chair opposite Mr. Garcia's desk, his hands fidgeting nervously. Mr. Garcia pushed a folder toward him. "Your progress," he began, looking at Darnell over the top of his glasses, "has been remarkable. I've been reviewing your grades, your work, and I have to say, I'm impressed." Darnell felt a flush of pride wash over him, but he kept his voice steady. "Thanks, Mr. Garcia. I've been trying harder lately." "It shows, Mr. Garcia said with a smile. "But I think you can go even further than this. Have you thought about college?" Darnell's stomach flipped. College? The idea of it had always seemed like something that belonged to other people, not to someone like him, someone who had to fight just to survive each day. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he wanted to make something of himself. He had dreams, big ones, and the idea of college wasn't as far out of reach as it had once seemed. "I don't know, sir," Darnell said quietly. "It just feels so impossible. My family, we've got a lot going on. I don't even know if it's something I can afford." Mr. Garcia leaned forward, his gaze intense but kind. "Darnell, I know it feels like a big leap, but I think you have the potential to do something great. And there are scholarships, financial aid. There are ways to make it happen if you're willing to work for it. And from what I've seen, you've got the drive." Darnell swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the words settle on his shoulders. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Garcia smiled, sliding a glossy brochure across the desk to him. "Here's some information on Franklin University. It's a great school, and they offer excellent financial support to students like you. Take a look." Darnell took the brochure, his fingers brushing over the sleek paper. Franklin University. It sounded like a dream. He felt a mix of excitement and fear bubbling in his chest, unsure whether this was just another distant fantasy or something that could actually come true. But the brochure in his hands was real, and so, maybe, was the possibility of a future he'd never dared to believe in. The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, and Darnell stood up. He tucked the brochure into his backpack and thanked Mr. Garcia before heading out of the office. Later that evening, as Darnell sat at the kitchen table with his mother, he couldn't shake the thought of college from his mind. William's voice echoed in his ears, the promises he'd made to Darnell and his family, the belief that anyone could rise above their circumstances if they had the right support. Could this be the chance he'd been waiting for? Could he really do this? As Darnell pondered these questions, A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find William standing on the other side, a stack of books in his hands and a wide grin on his face. "Thought you might need some help with your studies," William said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I've got some books here, and I want to make sure you've got everything you need to succeed. You've got a bright future ahead of you, Darnell. I'm just here to make sure you don't waste it." Darnell's heart swelled with gratitude. He wasn't alone in this journey anymore. He had the support of people who believed in him, people who were willing to invest in his future, and that made all the difference. As William sat down across from him, handing over the books, Darnell realized something. No matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he was no longer facing it alone. And for the first time in a long while, Darnell felt like anything was possible. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long, soft streaks of light across the room. Darnell sat at his desk, surrounded by scattered papers, textbooks, and a pile of old letters from college admissions. His mind was racing, but his hands were steady as he sifted through the paperwork. He had made it this far, not just in his academic life, but in everything. The dream he once thought impossible, the one that seemed so far out of reach, was now right in front of him. His heart pounded as he reached for the brochure from Franklin University. The glossy pages glimmered under the morning light, and as Darnell turned them over in his hands, a sense of both pride and anxiety filled his chest. This was it. This was the opportunity that could change everything. The college application was due in just a few weeks, and Darnell couldn't afford to miss a single detail. "Hey, kid, you're really going for it, huh?" The voice of William Harrington echoed through the door, and Darnell looked up to see him standing in the doorway. His tall frame filled the space, but there was no pressure in his presence, just warmth, encouragement, and a sense of quiet confidence. Darnell smiled, his nerves settling as he stood up from the desk and walked over to greet him. "I have to," he replied, his voice firm but filled with gratitude. "I've come too far to let this slip by. I won't let anyone down. Not you, not my mom, not myself." William nodded, a glint of admiration in his eyes. "I've seen you work harder than anyone else. You've earned this chance, Darnell. Don't let fear or doubt hold you back. Keep pushing forward. You're not alone in this." The support from William, who had become more than just the man Darnell had saved, but a mentor and a friend, had been a lifeline. Over the past few months, William had been there at every step of Darnell's journey, providing books, offering advice, and most importantly, believing in him when it seemed like no one else did. He had given Darnell the confidence to aim higher, to look beyond the present struggles and see a future where he could be more than just a product of his circumstances. Darnell nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. "I won't forget this," he said quietly, glancing down at the brochure once more. He could see it now. The campus, the bustling student life, the possibilities. It was a future he had dreamed of, and now it was within reach. All he had to do was take the next step. As the days passed, Darnell worked tirelessly to complete his application. Each essay, each question on the form felt like a test, not just of his academic abilities, but of his resolve. He poured his heart into every word, reflecting on the struggles he had faced, the people who had helped him, and the person he had become in the process. Writing those essays was more than just an assignment. It was a way for Darnell to prove to himself that he deserved this chance, that he was worthy of the future he envisioned. But there were moments of doubt. Late at night, when the weight of his family's struggles seemed too much to bear, when he thought about the financial burdens that still loomed over them, Darnell would close his eyes and wonder if it was all worth it. Could he really make it out of this life? Could he really build a future that was different from the one his mother had known, from the one his father never had the chance to live? But every time those doubts crept in, he remembered the faces of the people who had supported him, William, his teachers, his mother, and the words they had shared. They had all believed in him, and now it was his turn to believe in himself. He wasn't just fighting for his future anymore. He was fighting for his family, for the legacy he wanted to build, and for the promise he had made to himself to never give up. The night before the application deadline, Darnell sat down with his mother at the kitchen table. The only sound was the rustling of papers as they went over the final details. Angela looked at him, Her eyes filled with pride, but also with a quiet sadness. She had given up so much to raise him, to make sure he never felt like he was less than anyone else. And now, she could see the man he was becoming, the one who would carry their family forward. "Are you sure about this, Darnell?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with hope. "I know it's a big step. I don't want you to feel like you have to do this just for me." Darnell reached out, taking her hand in his. "I'm doing this for us, Mom. For you. You've sacrificed everything to get me here. This is my chance to give back, to make it all mean something." Tears welled up in Angela's eyes as she squeezed his hand. "I know you will, baby. I've always believed in you. But remember, it's not just about where you end up. It's about the person you become along the way. You've already made me proud." With a deep breath, Darnell clicked the Submit button on his application. It was done. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. His heart raced as he leaned back in his chair, his body tense, waiting for the confirmation email that would signal the beginning of his next chapter. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation. Darnell focused on his schoolwork, finishing the semester strong, but the weight of the unknown gnawed at him. What if he didn't get in? What if the dream he had fought for slipped through his fingers? But through it all, he remained determined. The journey wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. And no matter what happened, Darnell knew one thing for certain. He would keep moving forward. With each step, with every decision, he was shaping his future, one that would be brighter, stronger, and full of promise. As the acceptance letters began to roll out, Darnell sat on the edge of his seat, staring at his laptop. His mother, sitting beside him, was holding her breath. And when the email from Franklin University appeared in his inbox, Darnell's heart stopped. With trembling hands, he opened it. "Congratulations, Darnell Thompson. We are pleased to offer you admission to Franklin University." A rush of emotions flooded through him. Relief, joy, disbelief. He had done it. He had made it. Tears filled Darnell's eyes as he turned to his mother. "We did it, Mom. We made it." Angela wrapped her arms around him, both of them overwhelmed with the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about college. It was about the journey, the struggle, and the people who had helped them along the way. It was about the promise of a future that was finally in reach. As Darnell looked out the window, the world seemed a little brighter. He wasn't just a kid from a broken home anymore. He was a young man on the rise, a young man with a future. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Darnell knew that this was only the beginning. There was more to come, more to prove, and more lives to touch. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, Darnell could see it clearly. His journey had just begun. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to Darnell's incredible journey. Your support means the world to us, and we hope this story has inspired you as much as it has inspired us. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Stay tuned for more, and remember, your kindness and determination can change lives, just like Darnell's. See you in the next one.